Mark, are you there?
Yeah, can you see my screen at this point?
Yep.
What's that?
Yes, I can see it fine.
And you're looking at the first slide. I'm going to.
All right, it is 4 o'clock Eastern time, so let's get going. Welcome everyone to our monthly webinar series for the National Park Service's Connected Conservation Initiative. This is Brian Fainer, and I'm with the Park Service and help support the effort. As most of you know, our Connected Conservation webinars focus on how NPS staff and partners can use various tools and strategies to conserve NPS resources at the landscape and seascape level. We host a webinar at least once a month, and you can find recordings of past webinars in our internal Connected Conservation Toolkit, which is accessible to all DOI staff and also on our network, also on the Network for Landscape Conservation website. And there's links to both of those resources in the chat box. As a reminder, the webinar series is open to other feds, NGOs, and other partners. So in the future, feel free to invite your friends and colleagues to future webinars. And also in the chat box, you'll see a way where you can actually join our Connected Conservation mailing list by texting landscape scale to 22828, or also you can sign up online. We'll post today's webinar, a recording of today's webinar following the presentation. And throughout the presentation, feel free to plug in questions into the question box. And we'll host a Q&A following the session and following the presentation. And I'll review and ask those questions to Mark. And then if there's time, we'll also open up the phone lines for questions as well. Again, our presenter today is Mark Carr with the Institute for Marine Sciences at the University of California in Santa Cruz. And Mark has considerable expertise in the ecology of coastal marine ecosystems, which is critical to managing fisheries and establishing marine protected areas. And so with that, Mark, the floor is yours. And Mark, you may still be on mute. Mark, are you there? Mark, are you there? Mark, it looks like looking at the screen here, you're self-muted. So you may have to click on the little telephone icon near your name. Sorry, folks, we'll figure this out here shortly. We thank you for your patience. Mark, can you hear us? Mark, you may need to call back in and enter your audio PIN again. Mark, again, if you can hear me, you may need to just hang up and dial back in and enter your audio pin. Thanks for your patience, folks. We'll figure out this phone situation here in a few minutes here, or hopefully sooner than that. Again, Mark, if you can hear me, I think the best path forward here is to hang up and maybe dial back in and enter your audio pin. It looks like you didn't enter your audio pin.
Can you hear me now?
I can. All right.
Oh, yeah, for some reason it just disconnected us. Okay, are we all set?
We're all set. Go for it.
Okay. Sorry for that, you guys. I don't know what happened to the phone connection there. So, what I was saying earlier is that I'm not sure how many people have a terrestrial versus a marine background, but I've tailored this presentation with the assumption that most of the people on the call are less familiar with marine systems than terrestrial systems. Some of the key things that I'm hoping to get across today are first, the fundamental role that life history traits have, not just for species, but for populations, communities, and the ecosystems that they constitute. And in particular, when it comes to connectivity and population connectivity, one of the most important life history traits is just how far young disperse relative to the adult population. So the question, do offspring stay or do they disperse from parental populations? But separate from that, population connectivity, I also want to comment on some of the environmental influences that determine the kinds and strengths of population and ecosystem connectivity, and just how important that is in marine systems. And then the implications of this for ecological corridors in the ocean, and taken together, the implications for both the purposes of protected areas, as well as how you design protected areas to meet those purposes. So coming back to this topic of life history traits, it's, to me, as a marine ecologist who compares marine and terrestrial systems throughout my career, I find one of the most fascinating things is the critical importance of life history traits. Things like an individual's longevity, fecundity, reproductive modes, the life cycle of a species that are heritable traits that exemplify that species, and then how they influence population attributes, the distribution, structure, and dynamics of populations, which in turn then influence the structure, diversity, and dynamics of communities. So to get to that point, this slide illustrates the influence of terrestrial life histories, and in particular, the fact that most terrestrial species produce young that simply do not disperse far from the parental population that generated them. And I've sort of illustrated that in the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide, where you see that the young that are produced within a local parental population remain within and supply individuals for the next generation. And these are two separate local populations, and because of that limited dispersal, there's very little exchange of individuals between those populations, and we refer to these as closed populations. Now, even though the populations may be closed, note that many species nonetheless use multiple ecosystems over their lifetime, but the young and the adults are doing that in conjunction with one another. So they're staying together, for example, in breeding migrations. And I'm just going to talk about the sort of the key implications for protected areas now, because I'm not going to return to terrestrial systems, but it's because of this limited dispersal of young and the replenishment of parental populations locally that I think the general idea is to make protected areas on land as large as they can be, incorporating multiple ecosystems, and then also protecting any corridors that are necessary to connect those protected areas between different ecosystems. So now let's turn to marine species and marine life histories. And the first thing to recognize is that there's sort of two fundamental categories. There are pelagic species. These are the large species that occupy the open ocean, things like cetaceans, pinnipeds, seabirds, big fishes like tuna, and salmon that move vast distances in the ocean. However, the young remain with the parents, even though they're migrating over vast distances. So even though they have these very large ranges, the populations themselves are self-replenishing. And as such, we consider them closed populations. And it's oceanographic features that essentially identify the corridors that these species use as they move through the marine environment. And here's an example of that. This is a humpback whale migration patterns. Each of these lines illustrate a different population of humpback whales. And the areas near the tropics designated with a B are their breeding and calving areas. And you'll see that they migrate either to the northern pole or the southern pole to rich areas for feeding. And then they return back to those same breeding areas. And as such, those populations, the young and adults, all remain with one another and essentially create what we call closed populations. The same thing is the case for salmon. Even though salmon and other anadromous species that are born in freshwater migrate into productive oceanographic conditions and then return back to the very same tributary where they were born to replenish that very same local population. So even though these things are migrating vast distances, each one of these populations associated with a particular tributary are replenishing the same population and as such generally contribute little to the replenishment of other populations. Again, oceanographic features tend to define the migratory corridors that these species use in the ocean. And the only time that you get exchange of individuals between these different populations in different tribs is when somebody strays off, gets the return route wrong. And that's when you actually exchange individuals that sort of establish these as metapopulations, limited metapopulations. So I'm not going to talk much about these protected areas, the implications for protected areas for these pelagic species, but because they're closed populations like terrestrial species, the idea is to make these areas large enough to either, if you don't encompass their entire migratory corridor, at least you protect the integrity of the breeding grounds and the feeding grounds at each end of that corridor or that migratory pathway. And you might also establish regulations that protect individuals during their use of those corridors. So in the marine system, one of the big concerns for migratory cetaceans is vessel traffic and what we call whale strikes that'll take out these individuals as they're making those migrations. The other possibility for more open ocean species is to actually make mobile protected areas that track the oceanographic conditions that these species are tracking over the year. But these are all very different from the population structure of most coastal species. So the vast majority of coastal marine species produce young that are potentially dispersed great distances along the coast. And if these individuals survive, and if they're lucky enough to be brought back into shore, they actually replenish some other population, leaving that source population that produced those young reliant on the production and delivery of young that are produced somewhere else, right? So these populations are likely to more replenish other populations than themselves, and we refer to these as coastal open populations. And again, this is because the young are highly dispersive relative to the distances that adults range. And so now you see that graphic to the right-hand side of the slide showing that much of the production of young within a local population is actually exported to and supplies the next generation of some other local population. And in turn, the replenishment of that population is reliant on production and dispersal of young to it, right? So when this happens, these young are dispersing between appropriate adult habitats and ecosystems. However, sometimes they'll disperse to a different ecosystem in which juveniles then migrate from a nursery habitat eventually out to an adult habitat. And I've illustrated that in this graphic. So for these open populations, we're referring to the vast majority of coastal marine fishes, marine invertebrates, and algae, although as I'll show you, algae tend to disperse more limited distances than the others. And for these species, it's larval transport that is the primary means of connectivity across these local populations. And the populations, the spatial structure of the populations tend to be linear along a coastline. And I've tried to depict that in this graphic where I've got three different habitat types. So the closest inshore are habitats like mangroves, seagrasses, estuaries, the light green areas. The next are slightly offshore reef habitats. So in the tropics, they're coral reefs. In temperate systems, they're rocky reefs and kelp forests. That's the dark green patches. And then further offshore are deeper reef habitats. Again, either deep coral reefs or deep rocky reefs. And then the lines correspond to the transport of larvae from a source population, say down here in the bottom, to a recipient population. And typically, you see that they're moving between similar ecosystems, right? They're replenishing adult populations that inhabit the same ecosystem. However, in many cases, young that are produced in any of these ecosystem types actually will recruit to and use what we call nursery habitats, like those mangroves, seagrasses, or estuaries, or kelp forests. And then in this inset down at the bottom of that graphic, the juveniles eventually migrate offshore where they replenish the adult populations. At the same time, there's also movement of adults across these ecosystems, especially for spawning behaviors, where many deeper water species will migrate inshore to shallower waters. And these are all really important when we think about the space, the area, and the ecosystems that might be protected in a marine protected area. So, interestingly, what constitutes a corridor for these coastal species is two things. It's the ocean currents that are transporting larvae in some direction, and then it's the distribution of those habitats from which they're born and to which they recruit to and replenish another population. So when you think about ecological corridors in these coastal systems, it's this combination of the oceanographic and the seafloor habitat distribution that dictates or determines the ultimate movement. So now I'm going to switch to what I refer to broadly as ecosystem connectivity. And this is simply the movement of stuff from one ecosystem to another, right? And my point is that this is much stronger in marine systems than it is in terrestrial systems. And that's largely because water moves stuff really easily and further than air does, right? So whether it's organisms that are moving by ocean currents, or it's nutrients or biomass like the kelp material I'm going to describe, and energy associated with those, that stuff all tends to be much more fluid and more mobile in marine systems than it is in terrestrial systems. So the ecosystem I work in are these coastal kelp forest ecosystems. And a classic example of ecosystem connectivity in these systems is this enormous productivity of, in this case, giant kelp that is readily transported from where it's produced in the kelp forest, either onshore, where it gets dumped onto sandy beaches in the Rocky Intertidal, or it's transported deeper offshore to soft bottom areas, where again and what's common to both of these recipient ecosystems is that there's very little primary production. And so this kelp material that gets exported to these adjacent ecosystems become really important sources of biomass and nutrients and energy, and as such provides a really important subsidy from the donor to the recipient ecosystems. Now I want to quickly shift to what are the implications of all of this stuff for the purpose and the design of marine protected areas. And the bottom line is that you try to protect a network of appropriate ecosystems along the coastline, and across that network you protect multiple ecosystems within each of the protected areas. Okay, so for example, you guys are all familiar with this idea of SLOS, right? Single large or several small protected areas. And here's an example of the implications of that in coastal marine, the design of coastal marine protected areas. So on the left, I've got a coastline with one big old marine protected area along the coastline. And the species within that protected area are generating young that are then being transported outside of that protected area for as far as the larvae and propagules can disperse, which is dictated by how long they're in the water column and the velocity of the patterns of the currents. So the issue here is that the individuals protected in that area replenish populations outside only as far as the larvae can disperse. And imagine, for example, if you're a fisherman in this area, you've just taken all access to your fishery, and in contrast to a fisherman in this part of the coast that continues to fish and in fact is benefiting from all that production of young that are replenishing your fishery, which is in contrast to a fisherman further up the coast that's not realizing any effect of the protected area. If you take the same area and you break it up into smaller units distributed along the coast, and if you distribute them the distance that larvae tend to disperse, now you have you're replenishing populations along the entire coastline by the young that are produced in those protected areas, and you're reducing the local impact to commercial fishermen and increasing the number of fishermen and areas along the coast that are benefiting from that local production. So that's why there's not just ecological, but actual socioeconomic benefits of this concept of a network of protected areas that are connected to one another by the dispersal of young produced from one protected area to the next. Okay, so we go back to this graphic I showed you earlier, where I've illustrated now in these little red boxes potential places to put protected areas. And now what we've done is we've included within each one of those protected areas those multiple ecosystems, thereby protecting individuals as they move between those ecosystems, and they're separated from one another by the distance that larvae tend to disperse. So how do you identify what those habitats are? In the marine system, it can be pretty simplistic. So we know, as illustrated in this graphic, that you get very different fish assemblages on hard rocky bottom versus soft bottom habitats, right? Reef fishes versus more flat fish assemblages. And we also know that those assemblages differ as a function of depth. And as a consequence, if you identify the different habitat types, substrate types, and the different depth intervals, you can encompass the diversity of species that are supported across these coastal ecosystems. In addition to the depth and substrate, the species associated with those will vary as a function of oceanographic conditions. So you take that into account as well when you're identifying these habitats and ecosystems to protect. The other thing is you replicate those ecosystems to include the geographic variation in ecosystems as well as different types of MPAs. So an example of that is illustrated here again with fish assemblages along the west coast. And you can see that these fish assemblages associated with kelp forest ecosystems differ markedly from Northern California to Southern California to further down Baja, Mexico, right? So the implication there is if you put all your protected areas in one of those spheres, then you're not going to protect the biodiversity in that same ecosystem in other ranges of the ecosystem. And in fact, even within one of those large biogeographic ranges, we've done work that shows how community structure, the fishes, the invertebrates, the algae, differ markedly within a region as well. So each of these areas has statistically distinguishable community structure that, again, if you want to protect those communities associated with the very same ecosystem, these are all kelp forest ecosystems, it means you need to distribute protected areas across those regions. So that kind of helps to identify what you capture in a network of protected areas. One question is, how big do you make each of these protected areas? And the answer is that they have to scale to the movement distance, the home range of the adult species. So it's the fishes that tend to move the most. And even though fish move quite a bit, in these coastal reef systems, the vast majority tend to move rather surprisingly short distances. So a lot of these species are not moving more than a half a kilometer over their lifetime once they've settled as larvae into a local population. So that indicates that if you scale protected areas on the order of a kilometer or two, then you're starting to protect multiple individuals of a population with those limited home ranges. But then other species have larger home ranges, so the bigger you make that area that goes into protection, the more species you include with those increasing home ranges. One important thing to point out is there's all these species to the right that are highly mobile, even though they occur along the coastline, things like salmon, sharks, tunas, that will never benefit directly from these networks of protected areas because each protected area is much smaller than the home range of those species. So they could be caught outside of the protected area just as easily as in the protected area, and thereby not benefiting from that network. So then you ask, well, how far do you separate them, one protected area from another? And as I mentioned, you do that the distance that larvae disperse. So if we go back to how we estimate larval dispersal, this is a summary, a synthesis of dispersal estimates for a whole bunch of different algae, invertebrates, and fishes. Note that the scale along the bottom, the estimated dispersal distance, is log scale. And you'll notice also that the algae, the invertebrates, and the fishes differ substantially in their dispersal distances. So first consider the size of the protected area that we were suggesting based on fish movement, something on the order of 10 kilometers or so. At that spatial scale, the algae are all self-replenishing within the protected area, which is great because now you've got this self-replenishing foundation within each of those ecosystems in the protected area. That's the case also for many invertebrates. Again, especially things like corals that are foundation species as well, creating habitat for other species. But you see that many species of invertebrates have young that disperse much greater distances than would be included within the size of that protected area. And that's especially the case for fish, where the distance of dispersal of most fishes is well beyond the boundary, the size of an individual MPA. So then that suggests that you space those protected areas at these distances that larvae on average tend to disperse, right? And so that way, the young that leave a protected area have the opportunity to replenish protected areas further along the coastline. And notice that there's this trade-off here. The bigger you make a protected area, the more self-replenishing it is, and therefore the less reliant it is on other protected areas. In contrast, the smaller you make these protected areas, the more reliant they are on replenishment from outside, meaning that you got to make sure that there's a number of them, and they're placed close to one another to ensure that that replenishment from one protected area to the next. And then finally, I'm going to close with the last consideration of protected areas, which is, just how much you protect things within them. In marine systems, marine protected areas is an umbrella term that includes no-take marine reserves, where you're not allowed to fish anything, but it also includes protected areas with fewer restrictions that allow the take of certain kinds of species, especially those that we don't think interact with strongly with the rest of the ecosystem and are less likely to benefit from the protection of the protected area. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark, so much.
Cool.
Okay, folks. Again, if you have any questions that you have for Mark, feel free to type them into the questions tab on the right side of your screen. And I'm going to look through those questions. And again, if there's time, we'll open up the phone lines as well. All right, so we've got a question here. If you are a manager of a marine protected area, what are the tools and resources available to help you better understand what areas outside your MPA are critical to your site's ecological integrity?
Yeah, what tools you have? So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, if what you're trying to determine is the importance of some of these other ecosystems that you know are influencing the integrity of the ecosystems you're protecting in your MPA. So for example, and this happens, right? The people will make protected areas around coral reefs, but they'll neglect to protect the mangroves or the seagrass beds inshore that are the means by which, they're important nursery habitats and the means by which those protected populations are replenished. And so a lot of it is just a fundamental understanding of the linkages between those ecosystems. What are the important nursery habitats? What are important donor ecosystems that are probably producing material that's being exported to and fueling the productivity of your protected area. And then so the tools you have are first to gain that knowledge, right? Whether it's on your own or by academics or agency scientists that are really trying to define the importance of those connections. And then the second would be that hopefully the ability to convince others that a protected area needs to encompass all those interconnected ecosystems. I hope that helps.
Yeah, and here's another question that kind of stems off from that. Are there good examples of marine protected area networks in the U.S. and internationally that have used these principles to make sure the connections have been protected? So essentially, where are there places that are doing it right? Right.
Well, there's places that are doing it, and whether they're right, we have yet to, time will tell. So I'm in California, and the state of California developed a network of protected areas along the entire length of the state of California, from the Oregon border to the Mexican border. And they were based on these very principles that I've been describing. And in fact, arguably, was probably the most science-based or science-informed network of protected areas anywhere in the world because of the amount of science that was brought to bear on that design. There are other systems of protected areas, like on the Great Barrier Reef, that I don't think did not as explicitly apply this larval connectivity to the design of that system of protected areas. The California's system is the only one that exists, to my knowledge, in the U.S. There's an effort currently underway in British Columbia on the western coast of Canada to do essentially the same thing. And also, I think there's efforts on the east coast of Canada as well to pursue the development of network of protected areas. There aren't really, by design, networks of protected areas, to my knowledge, anywhere else in the world, including the Mediterranean.
Interesting. All right, I'm going to slip in a question real quick for you that I was thinking about. How have, I guess, broader fishing interests or, fishing industry, are they supportive or have they gotten involved in any way with marine protected areas? I would assume, part of the arguments or facts or whatever, I don't know how we, in
Sure.
talking about the importance of marine protected areas is that they help support sustainable fisheries. So are they involved? I mean, are they at odds with, kind of or are they supportive of the science? Where do they fit in?
Yeah, excellent question. So it varies, obviously, depending on where you are, but I'll draw from my experience. I chaired the science advisory team when the network of protected areas in California were designed. And that process involved fishermen in that design, right? So it's interesting because in that process, the scientists like myself came up with these sort of general ecological guidelines, but then fishermen and others, including conservation groups, were the ones that actually decided how big and where the protected areas went. So certainly the fishermen, both recreational and commercial, were not real fans of this concept at the time that the process was initiated. But I think they certainly appreciated being involved in the design, and in what was ultimately created. And then I think there's sort of mixed perspectives now, but in some cases, fishermen actually have embraced the idea, and in others, they still, are very concerned about their ultimate consequence to the the productivity of a fishery. So it's kind of mixed, and this is why currently we are involved in this really robust evaluation process to try to actually identify the consequences both within and outside of the protected areas of establishing that network. And it'll just take time. The systems are especially temperate cold water systems are typically pretty slow to respond. However, where protected areas went in the northern Channel Islands off the coast of Santa Barbara, prior to the statewide network, work that's been done there has demonstrated pretty amazing responses of the fish assemblages. And the cool thing is not only do you see bigger and more fish, greater fish biomass of many species, especially those targeted by fisheries within the protected areas, but even outside, it's gradually gone up as well. So it's not as though all that fishing effort, having been shifted, displaced outside, has led to really intensive fishing mortality and a reduction of populations outside, which has been great to see.
Yeah. Here's another one for you. How much does compliance and enforcement affect performance of reserves, and how do you ensure that?
So I would say only 1,000%. And there's been some great studies in the literature recently, but largely out of the tropics, where island nations have established protected areas, where it's become really evident that you're wasting your time making a protected area if it's not well enforced. And not just well enforced, you need the fishing community and others in the community to be compliant. And so this kind of goes back to your question, Brian, which is, the people's, especially the fishing community's attitudes about these protected areas probably really determine their level of compliance. And so it's unquestionably those protected areas that have higher enforcement and compliance that are the ones that actually start to demonstrate the ecological responses that we're talking about.
Okay. Here's another one. Can networks of MPAs be used to protect the highly migratory species like tuna and sharks?
I don't think so. And for the reason I alluded to earlier, that currently, especially in California, you know, the one regulatory action associated with the protected areas is to reduce fishing. There has been other things like reduced ability to discharge wastes into these protected areas too. But for the most part, we're talking about regulating the spatial pattern of fishing mortality. And for highly mobile species, it just doesn't matter. I could catch that salmon or that shark outside, even if I don't catch it in the protected area, 3 hours later, I can catch it outside of the area, right? But on the other hand, people have suggested that where some of these species might aggregate, especially say for salmon, if they're aggregating at the mouths of rivers prior to migrating up rivers, and if the concentration of some of these highly mobile species makes them especially vulnerable to fishing mortality, then you might you might reduce mortality to some extent. But I think arguably you can reduce that mortality in other ways without having to employ a spatial approach. And then the other is if you're protecting the integrity of ecosystems that those mobile species take advantage of, then you're indirectly benefiting mobile species. So, you know, if protecting kelp forests that juvenile salmon use as they migrate northward along the west coast, by protecting the state of those ecosystems that provide refuge and food as those little guys migrate through, that's an indirect benefit to some of these mobile species.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm gonna unmute the phone lines here. I'm gonna start going down the list and see if there's folks that want to ask a question that way. But while I do that, I'll slip in another question. You mentioned currents, you know, kind of serving as like essentially like a corridor. What about those MPAs that are kind of like in bays, you know, that where they have, thinking about like the Chesapeake Bay or San Francisco Bay, where you've got all these rivers, you know, you know, how important or how different is kind of the scenario planning when your you know, major vector of resources is a river rather than kind of more the open ocean?
Yeah, and I think the most important consideration in those cases is back to that ecosystem connectivity element, right? Which means, you know, you can do what you can protect the habitats within embayments and the species within embayments, but unless you also protect the quality of what's coming from those rivers into the estuaries, both the nutrient levels but also contaminants, then you're probably wasting your time, right? And so that's where that makes such a strong connection between the ecosystems outside and within the protected area that you really have to pay attention to the management outside of the protected area as well as inside. And in fact, it's interesting because sometimes that just highlights the importance of proper management outside of a protected area. And we have that here too. In the networks, even for species along the coast, you know, a lot of the larval production that's replenishing the protected areas is produced by the populations that are outside of the protected areas. And so It's clearly the better you manage fisheries outside of the protected areas will enhance the performance of the protected areas, which then hopefully feeds right back into enhancing the performance of the populations that are being fished.
Great. All right, so everyone is, for the most part, unmuted. So does anyone have any questions they want to ask over the phone?
Hey, Mark, it's Cliff McCready.
Hi, Cliff.
Hey, so I'm just wondering, in the California system, as you're monitoring the efficacy of these reserves, have you found that they haven't been put in the right place, or that environmental conditions are changing, or you discovered they were different from what you expected? And how is that issue going to be addressed if it's true?
Yeah, so there's sort of two elements of that question. One is, so we have not found necessarily that a protected area was ever put in the wrong place. I think because of all the groundwork that was done in determining where they would go. But nonetheless, you know, the idea is now you go out, you evaluate the performance of populations and communities, like with respect to population abundance or community diversity. And if there's evidence that those are not performing better than areas outside of the protected area, then theoretically and by law, the idea is that the system be adaptively managed so that those potentially would be taken off the table, and maybe some other area that, you know, that would perform better would be established. So that's one element. You know, what do you do to adaptively manage the design of the network? And again, it's going to have to be in response to the evaluation of their performance. But the other is this thing called climate change, right? And that's the big question that people have, where you have these changing environmental conditions that in the future will be different from the conditions that were used when we designed the network. And so the question is, well, what are you going to do if the environment changes in ways that that undermine the performance based on its current design? And that too will have to be evaluated. And that is a big concern that people have now, whether changes in sea surface temperatures or ocean acidification are going to negate, you know, the protection created by the MPAs. But the other side of that coin is that for these coastal marine species, the way they will respond to climate change is in one of two ways. They'll either adapt, but if they don't have time to adapt, they're going to move, just like terrestrial species. And we described how they'll move. They'll move by larval dispersal from one part of the coast latitudinally to another part of the coast. And so the question is, having established this network that facilitates movement, the protection of young being generated and recruiting to the MPAs along the network, in fact, we're helping to and facilitating the redistribution of species in response to climate change. And we have yet to determine that. It has, you know, but it'll be very interesting to see whether we've in fact made a tool that might mitigate or enhance adaptation to the changing climate.
All right, thanks.
All right, any other questions?
Good timing.
Yeah, seriously. Well, thank you again so much, Mark. But before we let you know, I want to remind everyone that our next Connected Conservation webinar is going to be December 12th at 3 Eastern Time, and that will focus on NPS engagement on energy and mineral infrastructures at the landscape level. And the Park Service Energy team will be presenting for that. So you won't want to miss that. All right, so Mark, thank you. This is just excellent. And the videos came out great. So thank you so much for presenting today.
You bet. Hey, thanks for the opportunity too. Both you and Cliff. That was great.
Yeah, thank you. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your week and happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.
Yeah.